Appreciate the opportunity to be with you again this morning. Since it's a Saturday morning and we had a nice casual breakfast, I asked Pastor if it'd be all right if I did something a little less formal than the kind of preaching that you heard last night and that you'll hear again tomorrow morning, and take an opportunity to talk through. Ignore the stickers here, by the way. I realized, I was like, boy, I don't normally have my computer up in front of people like this, so you can ask me about all those later. I'll tell you about all of them later. But for now, I'll just ignore those. I asked Pastor if it'd be okay if I worked through a presentation I actually put together a few months ago, or helped put together a few months ago, that I've done a couple of times and had a very positive response to. And it's partly because as a missions, working in missions leadership, I get asked a lot about things that we're seeing develop in missions and missiology. So what are the things that are happening that are exciting, that we may need to be aware of, that we should have some consideration of? Local churches and their missions policies are sometimes well behind the curve in terms of adapting to what's going on in the world, and opportunities are, in my estimate, without diminishing God's providence in the matter, opportunities are being missed because things aren't being seen and understood as far as their way they're developing in the world around us. And so I want to work with you this morning on 7 trends that we're seeing in missions. Some of these are great, some of these are cautionary, some of these are worthy of consideration as opportunities to pivot from what we have seen as a modern, traditional model for missions. But this isn't a 7 things that we're endorsing for missions. It's just 7 things that are developing in the realm of missions and missiology, because we live in a world where the climate is changing politically, socially, religiously, and that's not different than it's really ever been. It's anyone from any century, I think, could say that. Boy, this world is different than the one I was born into, right? We can all say that. Anyone who's ever lived has been able to say that. But it seems like in the world in which we're living, with the access to news and information and technology, that speed with which things are changing is really running hard. And so we want to be able to respond and adapt wisely to the opportunities that are landing in front of us. And so I'm going to work through these with you. Trend number 1 that we're seeing is a movement, and we will put this as from evangelism and church planting to compassion ministry and social justice ministries. Now, this, I would say, is not a trend that we are engaged in. This is a trend that we're seeing in the broader realm of missiology. Genuine missions is the work of taking the gospel across ethnic, cultural, linguistic, or geographic boundaries to people who have not yet heard or believed, in order to make disciples, teach them to observe everything that Christ has commanded, and plant disciple-making churches. That's the goal of missions. That's the work that's being done and should be done under the banner of missions. And there are various avenues through which that is accomplished, and sometimes compassionate ministry is an access point or an entry point. But we're seeing a significant turn from traditional career, primarily church planting focused missions ministries in the world today, to a more short-term, I'm going to scratch that missions itch or satisfy my missionary conscience by going on a 1 or 2 week missions trip every year, and I will do this thing or that thing that is really not part of efficiently or effectively establishing local churches, but more about meeting people's needs. So I'm going to deliver food and clothing to those in need, or I'm going to go and be part of digging a well and providing clean water, or I'm going to be engaged in ending human trafficking, or all of these things that are transpiring that are a blight to our society. All of those things, I think we could recognize, are good things. They may even be worthy of your time and energy. However, they do not fill the gap that is demanded with regard to the New Testament call to engage in missions or Great Commission ministry. One of our former presidents of the mission is somewhat famous within our mission family for saying we don't do world relief ministry, which is a reference to our financial aid that is available in times of political crises, natural disasters, or religious persecution, which millions of dollars over the last 45 years have flowed through our world relief program at Baptist Missions, including to Haiti recently with the earthquake that was mentioned there as well. We still have two families in Port-au-Prince, Marc Frere and Maxime Pierre, both of them Haitian nationals living in Haiti as well, continuing to serve there, and tens of thousands of dollars sent in world relief funds to help with church family that is struggling because of the crises that's going on politically there. I was in Nepal earlier about end of last year to deliver world relief funds to a group of Indian national pastors who are part of an association of churches that we helped start back in 1937 in Northeast India, who are currently suffering under Hindu nationalist persecution. 400 churches have been burned down. About 1,200 people have lost their lives. About 110,000 people displaced from their home, their traditional tribal familial homes have been displaced by Hindu nationalists. And we went and met in Nepal because we couldn't get into India. We couldn't transfer money into India because of the way they've restricted monetary transfers to Christian organizations due to this persecution. And so we met in Nepal, delivered cash to them that they carried back. We do those things not because they're missions, but because they're Christian things to do. And so there is, I think, a necessary distinction that remains necessary to define the difference between I'm doing good Christian things that represent the love of Christ and I'm doing missions. And these are two separate things often. And so we're seeing this trend of beginning, I mentioned this last night in reference to the way that we talk about missions and missionaries, that if everything is missions, then nothing is missions, and if everyone is a missionary, then nobody is a missionary. But there is a very obvious, distinct difference made in the New Testament between those who are called and sent and those who stay and do. And so we want to be careful to define those boundaries and operate with wisdom within those boundaries and not supplant the missionary endeavor that could be ours today in fulfillment of Great Commission obligations with merely doing, and I don't mean merely to minimize, but merely doing what ought to be normal Christian behavior in terms of expressing and engaging in compassionate care for those who are in need. So, do missionaries care for those in need? Yes. Do missionaries often provide relief funds? Yes. In fact, another example, the Waits, your parents have been a huge help to us in our world relief funds. I think we're probably close to $100,000 that have flowed through Slovakia and Romania and Poland. I think we have some friends, not our people, but some friends in Poland who have helped with Ukrainian refugees who have been flooding out of the western edge of their country into Eastern Europe, and just providing what's needed as they pass through. And that's everything from basic, toiletries and clothes to a place to stay and food for a few weeks. We do those things because it's compassionate, kind, and Christ-like. But that's not the principal goal of missions, to go and help people who are in physical need. The principal goal of missions is to bring to them the redemptive message of the gospel of Jesus Christ and see them turn to Christ in repentant faith, trusting Him alone for the forgiveness of their sins and the securing of their eternal soul as they come into fellowship with others in the body of Christ and establish local churches around the globe. So, trend that we're seeing, not one that we're participating in, but I think one that is worthy of our consideration and discernment as we think carefully as church families about what we do with missions dollars. Where does it go? How do we support missions? Are the things that we're doing actually missions, or are they merely Christian compassion ministries that may be worth our efforts, our interest, and even our dollars as a church family? But let's not call it something it isn't. Number two, the trend we're seeing is a movement from what I'm labeling as easy access, not that there are any places where the gospel ministry is necessarily easy, but easy access to creative access. There is a recognized pattern in modern missions that allows for a missionary to identify a place and apply for a visa. In most countries on the planet today, you can actually apply for a religious workers visa. So there's a special visa that most countries will give you as a missionary that allows you to come in and says, you're here to do religious work. We're okay with that. Here's your visa. You can stay for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever it is. No problem. That's normal missionary endeavoring in the modern era in terms of easy access, very few restrictions. There are, however, places in the world today, and it seems that they are increasingly more of them, that are creative access. The only way you're going to get there is to get there in some capacity other than declaring yourself to be a missionary and applying for a religious workers visa. Elena would be familiar with this process. Anyone going to the Middle East would be familiar with this process. It is an effort that demands careful ethical considerations for the missionary who's going. The last thing you want to do is go establish your ministry on the basis of a lie, right? So you're not going to lie about who you are and what you're doing, which means if you're going to get there in some other way other than a religious workers visa, you're going to have to be actually engaged in what you're doing to get there. I'll use Indonesia as an example. We have 3 families in Indonesia. It's a creative access country. You can't go there as a religious worker, but there are lots and lots and lots of missionaries in Indonesia. One of our men there works about 30 hours a week in a wholesale furniture factory that is exporting Indonesian craft furniture back to the U.S. and selling it in places like Pier 1 and these little home craft stores that you see all over the place. And that's his actual job. He actually has a visa to be there to do that. He's friends with a missionary from another organization in the same city who owns a pencil store. It's open 1 day a week. All of the neighbors that he has talked to about this American family believe that that guy works for the CIA. Because there's no reason to have a pencil store in that city in Indonesia. But as far as the government is concerned, he's a businessman there who came and set up a shop, and he's just operating a shop. It just happens to be the locals know that it's a pencil store that's open 1 day a week. I'm not trying to not trying to harpoon the guy. I'm not going to tell you who he is or anything like that. But it's an example of what it looks like to think carefully about ethical ministry. If you're going to establish yourself in a way that causes others to wonder who you really are and what you're really doing here, it's not going to be effective for your personal ministry, and it may not prove effective long-term for your relationship with the government. So creative access is a huge opportunity. And the fact of the matter is that business assisting missions is a great opportunity, a huge open door in lots of countries where the gospel could not or would not otherwise be present because it is not there in a nationalized form. And by nationalized form, I'm not talking about like Christian nationalism, like that kind of nationalism. I'm talking there is not a strong national church that exists there to self-propagate the gospel message. More than half of the world's population lives in creative access nations today. In fact, a quarter of the world's population lives in just 2 creative access countries today, India and China. 2 billion people, more than 2 billion people now, live in those 2 countries. In 1920, when Baptist Missions was formed, the population of the entire planet was 2 billion people. When William Haas, the founder of our mission, went to what is today Central Africa, there were 2 billion people on the planet, and there was a tribe of people in the heart of Africa, the Zandi people, for whom he was burdened. and he went. Fast forward 105 years, 2 billion people now remain in just 2 countries that do not permit Christian missionaries to be present. Now, you say India. India has a lot of missionaries. India has a ton of missionaries. In the last 6 years, the BJP government of the Hindu nationalist arm of the political arena in India has restricted Christian activity. They have ejected from the country and closed the bank accounts of major Christian organizations like Samaritan's Purse, no longer allowed to be there. Tens of millions of dollars flew through them to India. Their accounts all got frozen and closed a few years ago. That's it. Just over and over like that. We have 4 missionaries still living there. They're all Indian nationals. None of them are Americans. And the only reason they're allowed to be there is because they can't kick them out, because they're citizens. It's a desperate place. And all over the country, Hindu nationalists are persecuting Christians in India. 1.2 billion people live there right now, I think, is the last number I saw. Incredibly needy place, incredibly restrictive place. And so we are, as a mission agency, we actually are looking to embrace the opportunities that business assisting missions and creative access represents, pivoting in some ways with our Global Fit ministry, which is a status ministry with Baptist Missions that would allow someone to be bivocational, someone who maybe is one of 2 spouses engaged in ministry that doesn't require both of them to be actively engaged. Maybe one spouse could work apart from the ministry. It's interesting that here in the States, most people don't blink an eye when a pastor's wife gets a job, right? She teaches in a local school, or she works as a nurse, or she's got a job at a bank, or any number of other things. She works out of the home. Almost nobody blinks an eye at that. But a missionary goes overseas, and you have a primary ministry that involves one of those people in the same way that oftentimes local church ministry here does with a pastor. But if the spouse gets a job, everyone goes, whoa, 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 you can't do that. Because that's the way we think about traditional career missions. And there's good reason for that, by the way. I'm not bemoaning that. But we're recognizing that the day and age in which we're living, there's a lot of opportunity that is created when one person is able to work. For example, we have someone who joined the mission this summer to work in the Dominican Republic, the other side of your island, in the Dominican Republic with our play ball sports ministry. It's a baseball ministry that this summer had 700 young men participate in a week-long baseball camp, basically, on the Dominican side of the island. Guy who joined to lead that effort for the next few years, his wife is not going to be actively engaged in that. 4 kids at home, she works part-time. There's not a demand for her to be present in that, but that's an incredibly efficient and effective ministry in supporting the church in the DR. In the past, we would have had to say, we don't accept missionaries into our ministry who don't fit this traditional career model. And we're recognizing we've missed some opportunities there, and we're pivoting in response to that. And so, great opportunities to join Baptist Missions today in response to our interest in growing access in creative access countries. Next one we're seeing is a movement from the old model of from the West to the rest to now from everywhere to anywhere. And this, I think, is an incredible representation of what efficient missionary ministry does over the course of a century. In a number of places where we and some of our sister agencies have had ministry for 50, 60, 80, 100 years, there is a movement amongst those churches to begin their own missionary sending endeavors. So as we look around the landscape of where we have had missions ministry, Northeast India is an example of a place that has sent missionaries both in India and in Nepal. They have sent Indians to plant churches there out of the association of churches that we started. Our Peruvian field team, those churches, there's several hundred churches there that have been started by Baptist Missions. Those churches have come together to start a mission agency sending missionaries. Our Brazil field team, again, several hundred churches that have been started there over the last 85 years, have come together to start a mission agency in Brazil to send missionaries to Portugal, other places in Brazil, to Israel. Our German and French field teams, where they have had ministry for 65 plus years, have seen mission agencies start where the churches are now starting to send missionaries from their churches to other nations. We are seeing an explosion of opportunity for the rest of the world, apart from the U.S.'s involvement, to be engaged in missionary sending. And this is significant because for the last 80 years or so, the U.S. has been the predominant missionary sending nation in the world, and we still far outpace any other nation. South Korea, by per capita assessment, South Korea actually is number one, but just in raw numbers of missionaries sent, the U.S. is like 40 or 50,000 more than the next closest country, which happens to be Brazil, and then South Korea. And so as a nation that has predominated the missionary sending capacity of the church, it's an encouragement to see other places and other nations, the churches there being healthy to the degree that they are not just curious about what it would look like to start other churches and send missionaries, but actively engaged in doing that. And when you think about it, the missionary sending capacity for the church has been on the move since the day of Pentecost. I mean, it started in Jerusalem, and then it went to Antioch, and you fast forward through the centuries, it goes from there to North Africa, and then Southern Europe, and then Western Europe, and then the British Empire, and then on to America. And we recognize that for 2,000 years, the missionary sending capacity for the church has been on the move all over the globe. And if God's continuing to move it, we're not going to be able to change His determined will in that matter. But we're pleased to be a part of it and excited when we see it taking place in and from other places around the globe. And so this is a great trend that we're seeing in missions, particularly in light of what I would consider to be somewhat discouraging news on the regular about the condition and health of the church in North America. I mentioned last night that the church in North America, depending on which survey you're looking at, between 70 and 90% of evangelical churches are plateaued, declining, or dying. We have a week-long training ministry that we conduct a couple times a year called Shepherding Healthy Renewal, which is designed to train pastors in church revitalization. And it's principally because we're looking around at our constituency of churches going, boy, something has happened here. Something is happening in the church in the U.S. in the last 40 years that has just sent most congregations into a spiral and decline. I don't think a lot of churches recognize how hard it is to find a pastor these days, how difficult it is to find a pastor. I know of dozens of churches that have been without a pastor for more than 2 years. And a church without a pastor is a church that is spiraling. It's outside of God's design for leadership, and it's not going to be efficient or healthy. And so we're recognizing that as the church in North America struggles in many ways, the church around the globe is, I don't want to say picking up the slack as if it's our singular responsibility, but the gap is being filled, and it's wonderful to see and watch. Another movement that we're seeing is from career missionary ministry to short-term missionary ministry. I mentioned this already in reference to that first trend, but in 1812, Adoniram Judson boarded a ship bound for India after selling everything that he had with the intention of never returning. I'm going, and I don't expect to ever come back. And he didn't return for 30 years, and only once for a brief visit. Judson died in India in 1850 after 37 years of service, mostly in Burma, but in that same region of the world. And it's actually a fairly typical representation of his generation of missionary servitude. The late 1800s, early 1900s represented a time in the modern missionary endeavor where men and women just said, I'm surrendered and going. My life is committed. It's not mine to live anyways, so I'm going to surrender it to Him. He'll do with it what He pleases. Today, 2 weeks every few years without learning a language or culture while still calling it missions seems to be the predominant exercise in the church. And I'm willing to say that I think this is part of the problem that we're seeing with missionary recruitment. I think around our circles of mission agencies, and by that I would mean those involved in supporting and serving independent Baptist churches. Mission agencies in our circles are all seeing the same thing. Pretty steady decline in new missionary recruitment. And you say, well, what's the problem? Aren't you guys doing enough recruitment? And I would suggest that the problem is that every mission agency, like any Bible college, is downstream of the local church. And if the health of the local church is declining, what are you going to see? Fewer men and women going to Bible college to be prepared for local church ministry. As a consequence of that, fewer people being called out of the church into full-time ministry. And so the consequence is downstream, way over here, we have this declining census. And it's part and parcel because we live in a generation that is relatively low commitment about everything. And I don't mean Gen Z. I mean the generation that is alive today. Now, some of you in the older generation go, we were a high commitment generation. I can get on board with that. Okay, I'm not assaulting you in this, but generally speaking, all of us have been as Americans living in this century. We have all been conditioned to a kind of low commitment mentality, right? We don't want to sign up for a long-term service. We don't want to sign a contract for a long-term cell phone plan or a gym membership or a discount club at the grocery store. We don't want to sign up for those things because it's a big commitment. That's mildly representative of a bigger problem that I think is manifest in missions, which is we're willing to do small things sometimes and call it sufficient, when in actuality what God demands of us is a life of surrendered service, which we'll deal with more tomorrow morning, so I won't belabor that point. So, of course, the problem with this is that people go for the wrong reasons on short terms. They bear little gospel fruit. They rarely result in career missionary transition. The cost is incredibly high compared to the amount of work that's being done. It places pressure on missionaries who are there committed to long-term service to produce results. Of course, there are some positives to short-term investment. I'm actually a fan of short-term trips. I just don't think it should be the exclusive exercise. It does produce greater global vision. It does give people a better understanding of how they can pray for global missions. It does produce fruit when connected to long-term team workers. And it does build relationships with missionaries that are profitable for both the missionary who's overseas and the church here who has connected with them in a short term. There are some benefits. It shouldn't be abandoned, it shouldn't be avoided, but it certainly shouldn't become the predominant exercise in missions today. Trend number 5, going from supporting Americans to supporting nationals. K.P. Yohannan in the 1980s popularized the approach that is known, that Gospel for Asia is known by, which is a rationale that national pastors can do it better for less, and so we want to appeal to the consumeristic American mindset. And so how far can your mission dollars go if you're giving it to an American who's going and having to learn the culture and learn the language and establish themselves in the community versus your dollars that could go to a national partner who already knows the language, already knows the culture, and is already established in the community. There are some obvious advantages to engagement with national partners. It's part of the reason that every one of our overseas missionaries has a national pastoral fund that is designed to allow them to help support the work of national pastors that are trained and developed underneath them. There is a necessary avenue for resources to flow this way. But of course, there's a great challenge in this too, because oftentimes the challenge is in vetting and accountability. It oftentimes in various regions of the world smacks of colonialism. So I don't want to come do this work. I'm going to pay you to do the work for me. And I will govern and manage every dollar and cent that passes through your hands. And I will tell you what you can and can't do. And so there's this kind of managerial class that enters the arena in this kind of focused support exclusively for national pastors. The model is not reproducible in most places. In the developing world, the model of a group of people here collecting their money and sending it to another nation to support a national pastor there, in most places in the developing world, that is not a reproducible model for missions. The model that we need to be encouraging is a model where the church says we're going to support our pastors and we are going to grow ourselves here locally first. We are going to engage in the Jerusalem before we go to the uttermost parts of the world. It communicates the idea that the gospel expansion is heavily dependent upon money. Of course, this is a problem. If we're going to consider the ROI on missionary dollars, what we're really saying is what happens as a result of God's work in the hearts and minds of men and women and bringing them unto himself and redeeming them is entirely dependent upon how much money we can flood that market with. And of course, that's not true, is it? And so we want to be careful about the notion that all we need to do is pour more money into the national environment wherever we have missionaries going, and that will produce more and more results. It also has the capacity, and we've seen this over and over, to stunt the giving in the national churches. If a national church is entirely dependent on U.S. dollars flowing in, it's going to stunt the giving of the national church. They're not going to sense the need or urgency. It's going to create loyalties to a money flow rather than a theology. It appeals to the wrong motives. I can't even begin to tell you how many dozens and dozens of emails a week we get at Baptist Missions from people we have never heard of who are telling us they would love to work with us and they just need to know how to set up an account so that they can begin receiving funds. There is a huge global mindset of American missionary dollars can just be sent to me. And we don't do that because it appeals oftentimes to the wrong motives. It also gives us, not just Americans, but us anyone who would engage in this, it gives them the excuse to not go and send, rather just to write a check. And Wade Coggins wrote in Evangelical Missions Quarterly in July of 1988, he said this: "If our churches give only their money and not their sons and daughters, our missionary vision will be dead in a generation or less. We cannot substitute money for flesh and blood." The call is to support the work. Oftentimes that is done through monetary engagement, but that is not sufficient. And if all we do is write a check and send it, and I'm speaking to the choir here as a church that is currently sending a missionary from your own congregation, pastor's own family, overseas, preaching to the choir here when I say this. But if we don't surrender our own children to this work, the missionary vision will be dead. And I think we're seeing some of that brought forth in the world that we're engaged in right now. Again, one that relates to money and missions, from traditional financial support models to creative financial support models. So we're talking about someone who is maybe in business assisting mission or working remote, or they have a working spouse, or they are engaged in early retirement, or they have some sort of opportunity as a citizen of another nation to work in that nation. Oftentimes this is the challenge with getting access to a country where you can't go as a traditional missionary, is that as a foreign citizen, you also can't work there. And so the question that I often ask young people when I'm on college campuses, because there are a lot of international students on college campuses, I ask the question, where will your passport get you that an American can't go? And where can you go and work and live and do ministry? And we are seeing a shift from traditional financial support of someone taking a year or 2 or 3 to raise their support from local churches and individuals, to those who are saying, I have opportunities to go and engage. Now, we have this mindset about the Apostle Paul that he was a tent maker missionary, right? The fact of the matter is that from any reasonable assessment of the Apostle Paul's missionary journeys, he might have spent as little as 3 months actually making tents. That really doesn't represent the entirety of his missionary model. Nevertheless, he did engage in it when it was necessary. And I think there is reasonableness to the question, is it necessary for me to get to the field to do this now? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is absolutely yes. And so we're seeing a movement in this direction, which is good. And for the sake of time, I won't, again, belabor that because we've talked quite a bit about things that relate to that. Last one here, trend number 7, from reaching nations around the world to reaching nations across the street. The fact of the matter is that the world is coming to our doorstep, even if they're coming illegally, many of them. 14.5%. Actually, this is an old number. I think it's closer to 20% now. No, that's not right. 18% was the number I saw most recently. Around 18% of the U.S. population is foreign-born. Now, where do you think most immigrants are coming from? Obviously, the answer that most of us would give is they're coming from south of the border because that's what we see on the news, right? But actually, the largest number of immigrants in this country over the last decade have been from India. And most of them have been legal immigrants who have come here on work visas or just an application for residency. There is an enormous population of Indians in this country right now, but Chinese, Philippines, Salvadorian, and Mexican, they're all in the top, those are the top 5 right there, according to a Pew Research study in 2022, which is probably a little outdated at this point. And 77% of these entered the country legally. We have to see immigration at least reasonably through the lens of gospel opportunity, not just the political disposition that reflects our feelings about immigration. And I have pretty strong feelings personally about immigration, especially illegal immigration, and in particular, immigration that doesn't include enculturation. I personally have very, very strong feelings about that. But that's not going to change, shouldn't change, my personal approach to another individual who stands in front of me in a grocery store or gas station or in my church, who looks different than me and sounds different than me, and I don't understand how they got here or why they're here. My personal approach to them is not going to, it cannot reflect what personal feelings I have about policy matters and political issues. It has to reflect this person may be a soul yet in need of a Savior. So how can and will I engage them in matters which relate to eternity and would prove efficient in an effort to reach the lost? Every year, we have over 1 million international students who come here on student visas. Many of them come from creative access countries where missionaries cannot go. One of the most efficient ministries that we have in the U.S., as far as I'm concerned as the administrator for North American Ministries, is our Campus Bible Fellowship mission. The Campus Bible Fellowship group, meeting on 16 campuses across the country, the predominance of those students involved in CBF are international students. Many of them from creative access countries. Most of them will return home. We have missionaries who are continuing to do weekly Bible study with students that they had in their CBF chapters 5, 6, 8 years ago, who have been home now for the better part of a decade, but are still being discipled as a result of the contacts that were made here. We have to see the gospel opportunity. I actually have in my notes here the Haitian migration that's taking place, and those that are leaving Haiti, the wave of Latinos who have come from South and Central America. Right near our offices in North Olmsted, Ohio, is an enormous Middle Eastern population, Iranian especially. We have a church plant on Staten Island that is getting ready to graduate. They just bought and refurbished a building on Staten Island that's right in Little Liberia on Staten Island. It's a little 3-4 block radius, where about 6,000 Liberian refugees left in the late 90s, early 2000s when war broke out there. And actually our missionaries who were there in Liberia had to be flown out on a UN helicopter. Those same missionaries in the year that they were home, realized that many of the people that they had known in Liberia who had come as refugees to the U.S. had landed in Staten Island. And so they went there and started a church there. There's an opportunity that exists to reach the world here on our doorstep. Now, we can't forget that the goal is not to, check the box on every nation. And I think there are people who, I'm thinking about adding an 8th trend if it weren't for the sake of time, because I know we're way over. But there are people who think about missions this way. The Bible says that every nation, tribe, tongue, and people will one day be present around the throne. The Great Commission says to go and make disciples of all nations. So my missions goal, this is their mindset, my missions goal is to check the box on every nation. We want to get every nation represented. And once we reach people from every nation, we have met the Great Commission mandate. And there is an opportunity for us to say the nations are coming here. We don't have to go there, which just means that gospel ministry should be that much easier and more accessible to us. Unfortunately, some are looking at this and saying the nations are coming here. We don't have to go there. And it still must be a both and arrangement. We respond to those nations in our next door neighborhood, but we also are sending those globally, because it's not about checking a box for a nation. Now we have a redeemed member of this nation. The goal is the individual salvation of souls who are in need of a Savior. And so we bear the light of the gospel message in dark places, trusting that God will do the work He intends to do in redeeming men and women unto Himself. And so we're faithful about sending to the uttermost parts of the world, and we're faithful about witnessing in our Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. For the sake of time, I have nothing more. Appreciate your attention and engagement this morning. Grateful for the opportunity to fellowship with you over breakfast. Likewise, I had never had a Haitian breakfast, but enjoyed everything that I put on my plate this morning. So well done for those who have participated in helping feed us this week. We appreciate that. Looking forward to tomorrow's Holy Land tour. However, I will say this. Having been to Israel, I came back from Israel and I said to my good friend, Jim Tillotson, I said, Jim, I now understand why I've never heard anybody say, hey, you want to go get some Israeli food? Chinese food, yep. Italian, yep. Mexican, yep. Never heard anybody say, you know what sounds really good right now? Some Israeli food. I'm looking forward to tomorrow, though. All right, Pastor, I'll turn it back over to you.